So a very big part of what we've been doing at Tres Espadas since before 2010 is researching what weapons are safe to do full contact sparring with. Now this is a pretty normal Arnie stick. It's really fast and it has a density of softwood, or maybe even a little lighter than softwood. It's very strong and it can take a beating for a while before it breaks apart. And when it breaks apart, it doesn't really splinter. It kind of bends in half in a pretty safe and injury-free way. Now, what we originally came up with is this, what for the best possible sparring weapon is this was what you would call a super stiff action flex, and it was for a time sold on the Dog Brothers website. And it recently, this one, it took about 10 years, but it finally died pretty good. And we can open this up now and we can see what's inside. Okay. And what is that? We still do not know what it is. Been looking around for a couple weeks. I don't have answers. But this weapon, this type of weapon, had a limitation. Look at how much it can bend. So when a weapon bends like this, when it bends this much, and the super stiff bend a lot less than the other action flex, then when you block and you get stung anyways by the sting of the other padded stick, then it doesn't send the right message to your brain. It doesn't say the message to your brain, oh look, I blocked correctly. So when we got to a crisis point in 2020 and we couldn't figure out how to replace these, we ended up going with Nihonzashi. And the Nihonzashi weapons, the Nihonzashi Gekken weapons, they're really interesting because they are much, much, much heavier than even their wooden bokken equivalents. Well, I would say they're slightly heavier than their wooden bokken equivalents. They're far heavier than an Arnie stick. Whereas these padded Arnie sticks were about the same weight. And they, of course, were not actually sticks. So we haven't tried to completely reverse engineer the Nihonzashi, but at Tres Espadas, the stick is not a particularly important weapon to us because we're actually concerned about using metal weapons like machetes or heavy improvised weapons like pipes and crowbars and that kind of stuff. Stuff that's likely to show up in an actual situation where you had to improvise a weapon. So this being a lot heavier really served our purposes really well. And then when it comes to our traditional martial arts side of things, we really like the Tai Chi saber, and this really made us dig deep into the Tai Chi stuff to learn how to use this better. Now, we did decide to not reverse engineer this, but try to use this design to improve our own attempts at making homemade weapons. So if we look at this, inside, I don't know if you can really see it or not, but it's made out of that, the core is made out of that white plastic weapon stuff that you see show up at HEMA gatherings. And the hilt, not the hilt, but the pommel here is made out of furniture shoe. Okay. And then the skin is made out of some kind of like heavy canvas. It's very nice. I have no idea where you would get this stuff or have it custom sewn. And so we haven't studied exactly what the padding's made out of. It feels like pretty standard foam padding, and there's some nice rope around the handle. And all these things add to its weight while keeping the core density, the density of the thing inside the core that keeps it stiff and straight from being too dense. And we learned how important that was when we first made our attempts at making our own version of this out of much less expensive materials. We don't think we're ever going to match what Nihonzashi puts together. This is a expensive sparring weapon that's well worth the money. We're not trying to come up with something to replace that. We're trying to come up with a cheap, usable sparring weapon. So this right here, this is hickory or oak or some kind of hardwood, and it came from a broom handle. And you can see where we had made it into a sparring weapon at one point. And the thing is, one round of sparring with this against a 11-year-old, and I couldn't use my hand for a month. This dense core from hardwood is too dangerous to be using as the core. It's too dense. We think that that's the property, is density. It's too dense to be using safely as the core of a free sparring weapon. Pretty decent self-defense weapon, though. I like it for that, but it is not good for sparring. So this completely failed to do this. So what we eventually came up with is we said, okay, look, if it's possible to do full contact sparring with these Arnis sticks, what if we just pad up an Arnis stick? And we did that. And this was our first generation of homemade sparring weapon that was successful. And we did not use duct tape. This is black gaff tape, also known as gaffer's tape. This is the kind of tape that they use when they're making a movie to tape down electrical cords. And it is almost unrelated to duct tape. It works a lot like duct tape, but the gaff tape feels more like canvas on the outside, and it's supposed to feel like that. It has more of a canvas feel to it than a plastic feel like the duct tape. So this has held up quite well against numerous fights up against a fencing mask, and duct tape never does. Take a duct tape boffer and smack it on a fencing mask for a couple rounds and see what happens. It's not good. This gaff tape has held up very well against fencing masks. So, there's a couple different sparring weapons that we would like to make. One is we'd like to make a Chinese whipstick. So here I have a rattan. This is a rattan stick. It came with some Arnis sticks. I ordered it long and thin. So it is the shape of a Chinese whipstick. Okay? Rattan is kind of hard to get in North America. And so we want to now, what this whole experiment is about this weekend, is using softwood. In this case, we've got our hands on poplar, which has about the same density as white pine, which is a low density pine. It's the softest type of pine that I know of. So this is it's a little thicker, right? It's a little thicker than the whipstick. But we're going to go ahead and try to make a sparring weapon out of this that can approximate a Chinese whipstick. And you can see I got it. It's about the same length. Okay. Now the other thing we have a need of is making some kind of sparring weapon that can more closely approximate the heftiness of a Chinese saber. So a Chinese saber, I mean, it's not exactly the same thing as what Americans would call a katana, but it is, in this case, a bokken, cold steel bokken here. This one's polypropylene, but It's not exactly the same size and shape of this, but it's far, far close. The Yang style Tai Chi saber is far closer to this design than it is to what is popularly called the Chinese broadsword in English. That Chinese weapon, the Dao, it's the Tai Chi saber is way closer to this than is your classical wushu Chinese broadsword. So that's why it was a real joy for us to finally get our hands on a full-size one. So to compare this to the other Nihonzashi, this is what we got first to replace our sparring sticks. We liked them so much, we got these guys. And they're a real joy. They're beautiful. If you ever had a fantasy of, gee, could I ever do full contact sparring with a Bokken and not kill me and my friends by doing so? This is it. This is your dream come true right here. We just love Nihonzashi to no end. They're amazing. Gotta clean that up. Okay. So, however, if that's expensive. Nihonzashi is not cheap. So the question is, can we come up with some kind of cheap approximation? And here, this is what we're going to be trying. So, this is the second sparring weapon we're going to be working on, is a heavier kind of weapon. So the thing is about Tai Chi Saber is you're constantly putting your live hand on the back of the blade, because it's so heavy that when you're whipping it around, it actually becomes useful to put your hand on the back of the blade, and then your hand is right there to do live hand stuff. And it's much slower. It's a much slower weapon than a stick. So that live hand actually becomes more important than with a stick. And so to approximate that, we don't have to have this perfect shape of a saber, in trying to get the cutting alignment, the edge alignment right with our strikes when we're free sparring, because we don't expect to actually be in fights with sabers. What we expect to be in fights with is weapons that are about the same length and heftiness as a saber. So can we come up with some kind of sparring weapon that will have that feel to where you got to use that Tai Chi saber technique with it? Can we get there using soft pine, or in this case poplar? I don't know. Is it going to be another massacre like it was with my hand back when we used this damn thing that should never be used on humans? I don't know. But we do know this. We do know that right now, before we touch anything, we know that this poplar feels very, very similar to the rattan compared to the hardwood hickory, which is probably hickory is my guess. Okay? Which the hickory feels like almost like a metal pipe in your hand. So, we're going to try to make something that you would have to use that would benefit from two-handed technique. Okay? Now, last time when we made this guy right here, we shoved the rattan into a pool noodle and relied on the tension inside of between the rattan and the pool noodle, and the gaffing tape to keep the weapon together. But that didn't work out. That was the one aspect that didn't actually work out of our design, and we ended up using Gorilla Glue. And so here you can see it looks slimy. It's dry, but it looks slimy, and you can see there's Gorilla Glue from where we Gorilla Glued this thing together, so the padding would quit sliding off the end. And if you also remember from my video about that, it took a lot of effort to push that rattan into the pool noodle. It was really quite involved. So, one nice thing so far about making these is we're using your traditional PCP insulation, your pretty normal padding for these kind of homemade weapons. And you can see that this stick just slides in. So instead of relying on pressure, we're going to be relying on glue to keep that on there. And this is the same thing with the thicker weapon design, right? So one thing we notice matching up the dowels to the PCP insulation is the snuggest fit, the fit that seems to fit, because they're not based on the same measurements, because there's the inside of the pipe, the outside of the PCP pipe, and then there's how much distance there's supposed to be between the pipe and the insulation. So it's not a direct correlation, right? So this is about 1/8 of an inch bigger than this was labeled, and same with this. So anyhow, you got to make sure that it's, this is a little snugger. This is easy to slide on, but compared to cramming it down into the pool noodle, it's a cakewalk. Now, I have a suspicion, which is that this weapon, when we're done with it, is probably going to need another layer of padding. Now, if that means 2 layers of padding and gaff tape, it might, if that's where we end up going with it, it might actually end up helping it be more like this, because this thing is so heavy. I still don't know how to get a sparring weapon to be that heavy, but not dense. It's crazy. So that's the experiment we're going to be doing, and while we're at it, we may or may not do a couple of short sparring weapons also with the leftover stuff. I don't know if we're going to get to that or not. Okay, that's it. That's the experiment I'm doing this weekend. Okay, so it's the morning. The glue has been set, and here's what we got. So we have not gaff taped anything yet. Okay. So for size comparison, here is a old steel boken. So this larger dowel is 1 1/8 inch thick. So about 2.9 centimeters thick. And the dowel itself was 39 inches long, which is about 1 meter long. And I had to have it cut to that from 4 feet. So, so you can see the handles on this is about as long as the Boken handle. I went the same way with the whipsticks. So the whipsticks are 7/8 of an inch wide. So a 1/2 inch more narrow, well, a 1/4 inch more narrow than the 2/8 of an inch more narrow than the thicker one, and you can see that it makes a big difference in the mass, right? It's just a lot different. Okay, so I also did 7/8 with the sparring dagger. So if I'm hitting myself with this, that's not going to be a problem. I haven't even put the extra padding in the end yet, and it's fine. I mean, I could spar with this right now, even without it's pretty safe to spar with right now. So that much went well. Now going up a level to the full-blown whipstick here. If I'm hitting myself with this thing, that could be okay as is. I think that's alright. So the whipstick length one, we'll tape it up and spar with it and see how that goes. Now where I have a concern now is this guy. The thicker, heavier one. If I hit myself with it, at first it feels like it's going to be fine, but then as it comes, when you really get it in there, nope, it's not going to be safe as is, but it's almost there though. It is almost there, so I'm going to, it is not like the hardwood core where you're definitely going to the hospital. This is it's real close to being usable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another layer of padding on there. So what we're looking at here is a pool noodle, for example, is much thicker. A pool noodle is much thicker than that amount of padding. Okay, so those rattan core weapons we have, they're shoved into a pool noodle, which is far thicker than that, at least twice as thick as that. So it would make sense that if even these guys needed more padding, it would make a lot of sense. It's kind of odd that they don't need more padding, these whipsticks. And then for the more baseball bat sort of thing that we're working on, yeah, it's no surprise at all. I mean, there's so much more wood than padding there. It makes a lot of sense that it needs more padding. So I haven't given up on these guys yet. But that's where we are the morning after. All right. Okay, this has so far gone a different direction than I thought it would. So here is the type of gaffer tape we're using. I think it's maybe not quite as good a quality as the one I used on the other ones, but it seems to be working. Here's the type of glue we've been using. Gorilla Glue. Okay, so a couple of things. So when this 1/7/8 of an inch had an easy time going into the core, going into the foam, I mean, that turned out to be a bad thing. So if you can see in here, I don't know if you can tell, but it's very loose in there, even with the Gorilla Glue. So on this one, I ended up making a custom. I cut it down myself, and I put the gaff tape on first, and then I crammed it in there like we did with the pool noodles with the glue on, and it stuck really good. Okay. But with the knives, we noticed right away that they were hitting harder once the gaff tape was on. Now, part of that's weight, but there's some kind of thing having to do with the tension. The foam's getting more compact. So the knives are still usable. We'd like our knives to be a little bit painful. What we'd normally be using is a cold steeled hard rubber Tonto, so you got to realize that's what these would be. competing with. So these whipsticks are now considered to be a failure, and here's why. Once you get the gaff tape on them, it is providing a non-trivial amount of pain. It's about like just getting hit with a stick. Okay, so here's what we think the formula is when you're using softwood. We think the formula is you need the diameter of the foam needs to be bigger than the diameter of the softwood. Okay? And that's not the case with these. And so that brings us to these guys that we made. So this is a 9/8 of an inch diameter, about 2.9 centimeters wide wooden dowel, made out of poplar. And this thing has been all gaff taped up. And the feel of it is extremely similar to this, which is exactly what we wanted, right? So the contact, now we do have 2 layers of foam on here. So we ended up using Gorilla Glue to put 2 layers of foam. Not 2 layers of gaff tape, but just 2, we glued foam together. So the outer layer of the foam is used 1.5 as much as the first layer of foam. So the contact level is not bad. We really like it. It's, if anything, it's a little too painless. You can sit there and rock yourself with this thing and it's fine. This is so much closer to the Nihonzashi than we were expecting to get, that it's actually really impressive to us. We were very pleased with this outcome. So far, the things I thought were not going to work, are not going to work. Okay, so let's explain why are we not going to continue this. One of the biggest problems with any free sparring weapon is that the core could break underneath the padding and you don't know it's broken. So then the question is, what is that broken core going to do to somebody? And this is why we do not usually use what I call PCP, but is PCV or whatever it's called, or PVC, the plastic tubing that's kind of brittle and likes to break. We don't use that because it's so flexible that it's hard to tell the difference between when you normally swing with it and when it's broken. And if it's broken, sharp edges could conceivably come through the padding and hurt somebody pretty bad. So that's why we don't use PVC. Now, so a core breaking underneath the padding and the skin is like one of the main problems out there with sparring weapons. So right here, to get this to work, we would have to load it up with another layer of padding so it had just as much padding as this did. And the big difference is it would be a skinnier core carrying the same amount of weight under the same amount of stress. This is going to be far more likely to break by the time we put 2 layers of padding on it. So this, in the face of this, is not good. This is failure. This has not worked. We're not continuing with that. We're not giving up on the concept of doing a free sparring whipstick, but that's not it. Okay? We've got some other ideas on how to do that, but that is not how you do that. So the knives are a go. We're going to try sparring with them. Not too bad. Not too bad. Seems like if you couldn't get your hands on the cold steel hard rubber tantos, those would be about the same amount of pain to get hit by. And then these bad boys are kind of a dream come true for us. Like, but we haven't sparred with them yet, so we don't know. We just don't know. But it might be like the ultimate in homemade martial arts sparring weapon right here. Far beyond our expectations so far. So that really changed radically from what I was expecting this morning. And that's what we got so far. Switch. Get my head, dude. Switch. My body, stab my body. Get in, swing and shoot my ass. Swing and shoot me. Holy shit, enough. Like this. Bitch, you're gonna try to murder me. There you go. Stop. Okay, so I just finished a 3-minute testing sparring round with these weapons. These big guys that we made worked really good. It felt really good getting hit by them. They knock you around pretty good. Maybe about like a little less than somebody with a boxing glove on. These knives, I'd say the pain level was almost exactly like getting hit with a cold steel hard rubber Tonto. It was quite nice, quite satisfying. The Tontos are better because you get the edge alignment, but as far as overall contact goes, these work quite nicely. This is the other big one we tested. Now there's a 5th weapon we tested that I thought was going to do better than it did. And that's this thing. So I went and I finished one of the... I went and I finished one of the Chinese whipstick buffers, even though we figured it was going to be a waste of time, but what happened was I really wanted to show that the width of the stick didn't really matter, because this is considerably narrower. This is a narrow width by 1/4 of an inch. That core stick, that core dowel there, is considerably narrower than this. It's maybe 2/3 the weight or less, maybe half the weight, maybe less than half the weight. Anyhow, so I used some extra padding and I finished it as best as I could with the resources that we had, taking the padding from the other stick and so on. And I'll tell you what, this thing right here, I thought with the padding, it was going to be just as it was going to hit just as softly as this thing does, as this bigger one does. It doesn't. This thing hits freakishly hard for reasons we don't understand. It's got the same amount of padding on it, right, as this. But notice something. Because the core is smaller, the padding on the outside is smaller. And so that makes the contact surface area with your helmet smaller. Also, the stick itself has a smaller contact surface area with the inside of the foam, and then the foam itself is smaller and has a smaller contact area. In other words, as dull as these are, the smaller one is sharper, if you will. It has a sort of, it's literally a sharpness, although these things are so dull, neither can be called sharp. But this has a narrower contact surface area. And for whatever reason, it hits harder than the bigger stick does. Yeah, that's weird. Now, these knives are made out of the same stuff as this, but the same diameter core, the same padding, but probably because of the leverage of the weapon, these were not excessively painful, even though they only have one layer of padding on it. And with this one here, you can clearly see that it has 1-2 layers of padding on it, right? So, yeah, this whole whipstick thing didn't work out today. It's like a problem. And we need a different plan altogether for making a sparring Chinese whipstick. And so what's really strange is these big old monsters we came up with. Oh, gosh, they're nice. They're great. I mean, don't get me wrong. You definitely feel it when you get hit by them, but it's about like getting hit by a Nihonzashi. It's really, really nice. The knives turned out good, and these turned out good. Very strange day, pretty much exact opposite of what I thought was going to happen. I thought those were going to work, and this stuff over here was not going to work. And it was the exact opposite. This is good stuff. This is all kinds of cursed. All right, that's the results of the experiment.